Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Yazad Jal. I am with the Center for Civil Society, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Victor Claar, who is the BB&T Distinguished Associate Professor of Free Enterprise at the Florida Gulf Coast University. He has written many books, including recently Economics in the Christian Perspective and Fair Trade, Its Prospects as a Poverty Solution. And he's the co-author of The Keynesian Revolution, Our Empty Economy, We're All Dead. Without much ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Claar. Please go ahead.
All right, great. Thanks so much. And it's great to be here. It's a holiday here in the States. And so it's wonderful to be able to start off the day with something so meaningful and to get to visit with you. The talk that I'll be giving today is based on my short book, Fair Trade, Its Prospects as a Poverty Solution. And the goal of that book was to write something that was comprehensible to somebody who was curious about economics and cared about the poor and wanted to know whether or not buying fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate or fair trade footballs would really make a difference in the life of a global poor person that maybe you'll never have a chance to know or meet or be able to see what their conditions are like either before or after purchasing the good goods, the fair trade goods. So the short book was commissioned by the Acton Institute, so it's very readable. It's about 75 pages, but it has about 100 or so footnotes. So if you want to double check anything in the talk today or read further, I encourage you to take a look at that because it is meticulously documented, even though it's not necessarily intended for scholars. When I first started to write this book, I wrote it as a meta study. So basically about 10, 11 years ago, I took a look at all the existing literature there was about fair trade initiatives. And there was a lot. There was a lot in the marketing literature that I hadn't expected to find, but that was very interesting to me. And what I'll do today is I'll summarize what I learned in my meta study of fair trade initiatives and whether or not, in fact, they are making a difference in the lives of the people that we're trying to help. Another thing that I'll mention is this. During the period that I was researching and writing the monograph, I was also involved in my local house of worship, my local faith community, with a group. And in this group, there was a wonderful woman who got our Fair Trade Coffee initiative launched in our particular faith community. And this woman is wonderful. She's a great person in ways that I wish I could be. She's kind and thoughtful and reflective, and she worked really hard to make sure that people that I attended worship with were able to purchase fair trade coffee from Equal Exchange through Equal Exchange's fair trade partnership with our particular faith tradition. And so every time that I sat down to write the monograph, these 75 pages, I always tried to keep in mind, what would I say if my friend in my house of worship is working hard in the cause of fair trade? How would I tell her what I learned and make sure that I tell it honestly, but also as a good friend and not as a troll on social media? So that's what I'll share today. Let's see here. So throughout the world, with the exception of the United States, whenever you see this logo, this blue and green seal with the outstretched arm reaching up, this is the seal of Fair Trade International. Now, Fair Trade International used to have a more clunky, less user-friendly name. It used to be called Fair Trade Labeling Organizations International. So sometimes people still refer to it that way for short. Instead of calling it Fair Trade International, they'll still call it FLO. So just be aware that if I shift back and forth, or if you come across that abbreviation FLO, it still refers to Fair Trade International. It just has a cleaner name now. And when you see this seal, as a consumer, you're given several assurances. And the assurances that you receive when you purchase this coffee and not coffee that doesn't have this seal, the assurances you get are these. This coffee was not grown in protected rainforest. No children were used in the production of this coffee. Everybody who participated in the production of this coffee that you're about to purchase right now, it was paid at least the local minimum wage. And the coffee wasn't produced by large-scale plantations. Instead, these coffees were grown by democratically governed cooperatives of small coffee growers. So how do you get this assurance, right? If I'm purchasing coffee in Southwest Florida and I see this seal or the seal for Fairtrade USA, well, how do I know? I mean, I got these promises. Can I be confident that the promises that are attached to the label are in fact being fulfilled in the location where coffees are grown? Well, this requires a certifying organization. So the reason that this seal looks the same everywhere in the world is because there's one international certifying agency. It's operated independently from FLO. It's called FLO Cert, and their job is to visit these cooperatives of democratically governed small coffee growers and investigate what the growing conditions are like and determine whether or not they can have the seal renewed. So there's an international monopoly. There's a bureaucracy that controls the usage and licensing of this seal. But when you do see the seal before you purchase your coffee, you do have these assurances. So I like to think about whether or not to buy fair trade coffee as sort of a moral dilemma. So suppose that you're in your local coffee shop and you're about to purchase some coffee that you haven't seen before, but the price looks good to you. You check out some reviews on your smartphone and your friends say that it's a delicious coffee, it's reasonably priced, and you're about to purchase this coffee. And as you're about to purchase it, you notice another coffee near it in the same display. And that coffee has the fair trade seal, and the coffee that you were about to purchase does not. Well, now what do you do as an ethical, moral, caring consumer? Do you do what you do in other market exchanges and buy the product that you like best, that fits your budget best? Or do you pay a little extra because if you've ever purchased fair trade coffee, you know that in almost every market, comparable coffees are more expensive if they bear the fair trade seal than if they do not. So now what you really are facing is a moral dilemma. You could buy delicious coffee with a low price. You could buy equally delicious coffee with a higher price. But if you buy the one that says fair trade on it, that sends a signal to you and to other people you might meet and see your coffee if they come to your house or if they come to your office. You now have a moral dilemma. Should I buy the coffee that good people buy, or should I buy this other coffee that is affordable and apparently tastes just as good? I don't know about you, but I like it when I'm able to think of myself as a good person. I really like it when you think of me as a good person. And so I might be sorely tempted, even if it costs more money, to purchase this more expensive coffee because it bears that fair trade seal, even though I can't really know for sure what's going on at the other end of the supply chain. But being a good person is even more complicated, because once you've noticed the fair trade certified coffee, you might notice the 100% organic certified coffee. Or you might notice the coffee that's been certified by the Rainforest Alliance. Now I ask you, what's a caring coffee drinker supposed to do? Do you triple your weekly coffee consumption so you feel less guilty, but at the same time you feel more guilty because you're so caffeinated and nervous about whether or not you've done the right thing? I mean, what is a caring person to do? So with that introduction, I think it's helpful to understand just a little bit about how the coffee market works before we dig into the details of how the fair trade model works. So the first fair trade initiatives were with coffee growers, and the fair trade coffee is certainly the biggest share of the fair trade market in 2020. So let's begin there, because I think we can learn a lot about fair trade initiatives through using fair trade coffee as a case study. Before telling you a little bit more about the fair trade model, I think it's helpful to know just a tiny bit about coffee. While there are lots of different varieties of coffee, there are essentially two main ones. And those two main ones are Arabica beans and Robusta beans. If you've ever had a cup of coffee that was so good it was unforgettable, that coffee was likely brewed with 100% Arabica beans. In fact, when you purchase coffees that are 100% Arabica, you'll almost always see a statement that says there are 100% Arabica beans in here, because you know that those are the good beans. They have a mellow flavor, They're not quite as caffeinated as Robustas, and they can't be grown just anywhere. In fact, they're not really suited to large-scale coffee plantation growing. Instead, Arabica beans are best grown in small batches at high elevations in places like Brazil and Colombia and Guatemala. The other variety of beans is the Robusta. And if you've ever had a cup of coffee that was so nasty, you'll never forget it. That coffee was likely brewed with Robusta beans. In fact, if I go to a shop here in the United States and I buy the only package of coffee that I know of that exists in the world that costs me $1, if you turn it over, it says that it was sourced from Vietnam, and in Vietnam, they grow mostly Robustas. And big surprise, if you take that coffee home and make a cup for yourself, it tastes like a $1 cup of coffee because it was grown largely with Robusta beans. Robusta beans can be grown just about anywhere in the world where the temperature is right. So if you take a look at this map, while not a perfect representation of where coffee is grown and which Arabica versus Robustas, which are grown in each nation, it gives you a sense of what sorts of coffees are grown in different parts of the world where the weather is right, where you're within the proper latitude to be able to grow coffees. So the Robusta beans are the dark shaded places, including places like West Africa. The yellow shaded nations are places where largely Arabica beans are grown. And then again, that includes places like Brazil and Colombia. And then the light green shaded areas produce a mix of both Robustas and Arabicas, and that includes Brazil, of course. So one thing to notice at the beginning here is that you can't grow coffee just anywhere in the world. There's a really good reason why we don't have coffee bean tariffs in the United States in order to protect Ohio coffee growers. The reason is because you can't really grow coffee unless you do it with great expense in a place like Ohio. So most coffee in the world is grown around central latitudes, and coffees tend to be grown in nations where there is a relatively large percentage of the global poor living in those locations. Something else that's helpful to understand about these two varieties of beans, Arabicas and Robustas, is the Arabicas, not only are they more rare, not only do they have a better flavor, once you plant a new Arabica seed for harvest, it won't be ready for that harvest until 3 to 5 years later. So it takes a long time for aspiring Arabica producers to be able to create more beans available for the market. Again, 3 to 5 years. Robustas are mature a little faster. They are ready in 2 to 5 years. And Robustas, just like the name sounds, are more robust. And so things like bad weather and fungus won't take out your Robusta crop as quickly as it might take out your Arabica crop. So just a little bit about background in terms of the coffee beans. Now let's look at the coffee market. From the beginning, advocates of fair trade coffee have made two price-based arguments for their fair trade advocacy. One is that coffee prices, like any other commodity, they move around a lot. And so if you're a poor coffee grower living in a developing nation, you're extremely sensitive to those tiny price changes because it's not like you have a lot of saving or accumulated wealth in order to protect yourself from one year to the next. Another argument that fair trade makes is that coffee prices are too low, generally speaking, and that it's very hard to have even a modest standard of living if you earn your livelihood through growing coffee, fair trade or not. So it's helpful to take a look at prices of coffee beans. So now you know everything you need to know to understand this diagram. So there are two lines in the diagram, one that in my presentation looks like an orange line and it moves around a lot. And that's the market price, the spot price of good coffee beans, those Arabicas, Class C Arabicas in the New York Coffee Exchange. And the diagram starts at the beginning of the fair trade coffee movement at the end of the 1980s. And you'll see that the champions of fair trade are correct about both of their claims regarding prices of coffee. If you look at that orange line, coffee prices are really volatile. They move around a lot. And you can see that the champions of fair trade are also correct about coffee prices being low and staying low. Regardless of what you're paying at retail in your particular market when you purchase coffee, coffee growers don't get a very big share of the purchase price of that coffee. If you look across this entire time span, it looks like, if you eyeball it, maybe the average price of a pound of coffee for the growers is about $1.50 per pound or so. And I don't know about you, but even for Robustas, I typically pay more than $1.50 per pound. So if you look at the market price of coffee, it sure seems like fair trade advocates are right. Coffee prices do move around a lot, and on average, they are quite low and haven't really increased over the longer term. Now, when coffee prices spike, like they do in the mid-90s a couple of times, and when they spiked in 2011, and when they spiked again in 2014 and 2015, I can tell you as an economist that when coffee prices spike, it's normally for one of four reasons. One reason might be bad weather in South America. A second reason that prices might spike is bad weather in South America. A third reason coffee prices might spike is bad weather in South America. And a final possibility, a fourth reason that coffee prices might spike, if you haven't guessed it already, is bad weather in South America. So when prices spike, it's because of bad weather in South America. And this is really bad news if your crop was one of the crops that was being destroyed by the drought or the frost. But this is great news if your coffee crop was spared from the bad weather. All of a sudden, you can charge a premium price. And in the short term, that premium price rations out the coffee that's available in the current year for harvest and roasting, wholesaling, and retailing. Now, coffee growers, when prices spike, would love to give you more coffee. But again, they can't do it in a short time frame. And the reason is Arabicas take at least 3 years to be ready for the harvest. Even Robustas take at least 2 years to be ready for the harvest. So in a short time frame, coffee growers would love to sell you more coffee at these higher prices, but they can't do it. It's not possible. Now, when coffee prices plummet, it's normally following one of these price spikes. So look at the market price of coffee in the wake of those two successive price spikes in the mid-1990s. The market price of Arabica beans bottoms out, down at about 50 cents per pound around January or February of 2002. Why is this? Well, lots of people around the world who weren't currently growing coffee in the 90s noticed the price spikes in the 90s and began to produce coffee, lots and lots of coffee. So 2 years later or 3 years later, we began to see a lot more coffee available for the harvest around the world. And in fact, this is when Vietnam entered the market in significant ways. Before the 90s, Vietnam was only producing about 1.4 million bags of coffee per year. But seeing these higher prices in the mid and late 1990s, they began to take a lot of land, transition it to coffee production. And by the end of the 90s, they were growing not 1.4 million, but about 14 million bags per year. So these high prices led over time to a supply response, and it was a massive supply response that caused the price of coffee on commodity markets to plummet. Now, you'll notice that there's a second line in the diagram. And the second line, the one that appears blue in my projection, is the guaranteed minimum price that coffee growers in the fair trade network receive for their certified fair trade coffees. So I mentioned the assurances that you get from the fair trade coffee label, but one I didn't mention is that when you're a member of the fair trade network, if you sell your coffee to a fair trade importer, wholesaler, and retailer, then you get a guaranteed minimum price. And so you can see that the minimum price only kicks in at times when the market price of coffee has fallen below that minimum. So take a look again at the date range from about December 2000 to roughly March of 2004. In that period, when the market price of coffee had plummeted, coffee growers who were fortunate enough to be members of the Fair Trade Network received the minimum guaranteed price. And so that's why the fair trade coffee line is horizontal in that range. Since the market price had fallen below the guaranteed minimum, all of the growers got the guaranteed minimum price. In addition, regardless of what happens to the market price of coffee, all the growers receive a couple of pennies per pound that is referred to in the fair trade network as the social premium. So notice what happens when prices rise, like they did in 2011 and in 2014. When coffee prices go up, the growers get the market price. But the blue line is always slightly higher than the orange line, because regardless of whether the coffee price is high, like it was in 2011, or low, like it was in 2003, all of the coffee growers get the social premium no matter what. And the social premium is intended to be used for projects in local villages, things like clean drinking water, healthcare, education, those sorts of initiatives. So fair trade growers always get the social premium. And when the coffee price rises, they get the social premium plus the market price. It's only when the price of coffee falls below the minimum that the minimum kicks in for those coffee growers. So I'm an economist, so I have one supply-demand diagram that I'll favor you with today. What I'd like to do is simply model why coffee prices are so volatile. So suppose initially that we're in a period where coffee prices are low, and they're around that average over time of about $1.25, $1.50 per pound. And let's do an experiment, say bad weather in South America. It immediately destroys much of the existing crop. And because it destroys much of the existing crop, supply decreases. And as students of economics know, if there's a decrease in supply, it drives up the price. And take a look also at how I've drawn both the demand curve and the supply curve here. The demand curve is almost vertical. And it's almost vertical because for most coffee drinkers, even if the price of coffee moves around a lot, buyers on the demand side won't change by much their daily or weekly consumption of coffee. So they're price sensitive, but they're not that price sensitive. And notice that I've drawn the supply curve so that it's also fairly steep also. So that when the price of coffee rises, coffee growers would like to make more available to you, but they can't make much more available in a short amount of time, again, because it takes 2 to 3 to 5 years to respond to those higher prices and make more coffee available. So when coffee prices move around, and they do move around a lot, as you've seen in the time series diagram, it's almost always because of bad weather in South America. And when you combine steep demand curves and steep supply curves, little tiny movements in either of those curves add up to big fluctuations along that vertical price axis. Another reason that suppliers can't respond so quickly, again, is that there's a limited latitude range, which is sometimes referred to in the literature as the bean belt, where lots of relatively poor people by global standards happen to live, and they're able to grow a lot more coffee in a relatively short amount of time, especially if they make their investment in Robustas rather than Arabicas. So now that you know at least a little bit about the coffee market and about coffee beans, then let's turn to this initiative of fair trade coffee. How did it begin in the first place? Why was it the late 1980s when fair trade initiatives began to start in different countries around the globe? A little bit of history is helpful here. In the early 1900s, there was really only one significant world supplier of coffee, and that supplier was the nation of Brazil. And because there weren't many global coffee suppliers, Brazil didn't face a lot of international competition from other countries that grew coffee. So, like a monopoly firm tends to do, and the nation of Brazil acted like a monopoly here. It had a lot of market power through scarcity. It manipulated the price. So the nation of Brazil regularly engaged in valorization schemes. And in fact, if a coffee crop in a particular year was huge, the nation of Brazil would destroy some of the coffee crop. In fact, in 1 year alone, 1937, the harvest of coffee in Brazil was so abundant that the Brazilian government destroyed, make sure I get the number right, 17 million bags of coffee. It set fire to them, and they only permitted 30% of their crop to enter the market that year. So like somebody with monopoly power. What do you do to increase your profits? You produce less, make less available to the market, and you charge a premium price. Well, other nations that were growing coffee, but not to the extent that Brazil were, they began to see what Brazil was doing, and they realized that they also could grow high quality Arabica beans. And compete, what they needed to do is work on their marketing campaign. So in the mid 20th century, the nation of Colombia entered the scene, and they used brand imaging. So this is the Café de Colombia seal. This gentleman's name is Juan Valdez. He's a fictional character. And anytime that you saw Juan Valdez and his trusty burro, so if you were an American coffee drinker in the 1970s, when you saw this, you knew that the coffee you were about to purchase was 100% Arabica, and it was grown by honest, hardworking coffee growers like Juan Valdez at high elevations in the nation of Colombia, and you were about to enjoy some delicious coffee. Well, Colombia was very successful when it entered the market and began to compete with Brazil, and that drove down coffee prices for Brazil. And then other nations followed. Other Latin American nations, nations in West Africa began to enter the market. And Brazil and Colombia saw what was happening. They were losing market share, and they were losing their ability to charge a premium price. So this set the stage for a conference that was organized by the United Nations in 1962. And during these difficult meetings in 1962, an agreement was brokered called the International Coffee Agreement. And what the International Coffee Agreement did in 1962 is it created a cartel that Western nations signed on to, that coffee producing nations signed on to, and it limited the annual production level for each coffee producing nation that signed on at the time. So this was great news for a nation like Brazil or Colombia. It limited the amount of future competition from each of these nations outside of their borders by imposing an enforceable cartel and quota arrangement. Now, why did nations like the United States sign on to an agreement like the International Coffee Agreement? We did it because the Cold War was going on, political tensions were high, and the United States in particular was concerned with certain Latin American Marxist threats. And so in the early 1960s, the United States and other Western nations signed on to the International Coffee Agreement, which was in force for a couple of decades until the Cold War ended. And once the Cold War had ended, the International Coffee Agreement fell apart because there was no longer an incentive for Western developed nations to pay premium prices for coffee. Well, the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement set the stage for the modern fair trade coffee initiative. And it happened simultaneously in two different countries. It happened in the Netherlands, and it also happened here in the United States. In the Netherlands, there was an international aid organization called Solidaridad, and they worked together with some Mexican coffee growers living in the Mexican state of Oaxaca to find new markets for their coffee. So they came up with the fair trade labeling idea, and they went after coffee drinkers in the Netherlands to try to see whether if you gave coffee drinkers in the Netherlands some guarantees that were associated with the seal, whether or not they'd be interested in buying your coffee. So again, the initiative initially wasn't to try to help out the Oaxacan Mexican coffee growers. The coffee growers were simply trying to find a way to market more coffee to coffee drinkers who otherwise wouldn't purchase their coffee. And the Dutch Fair Trade Initiative was called Max Havelaar. Max Havelaar is a famous fictional character from a Dutch novel, and they retain the name of that fair trade label today. It's Max Havelaar. At about the same time, though the United States was no longer as concerned about Marxist threats in Latin America as it had been, there were still some geopolitical concerns that the United States had in the late 1980s, including in Nicaragua. And in the late 1980s, the United States had a trade embargo with Nicaragua, and so it was impossible for a typical American to purchase Oaxacan coffees. This set the stage for equal exchange. Today, the biggest importer and roaster of fair trade coffee in the United States. That's its red logo that you see on the screen, the arrows pointing up and down. And they exploited a trade loophole in order to move Nicaraguan coffees around the globe so that they could import them into the United States despite the embargo and sell coffees in solidarity with the Nicaraguan coffee growers. But now that you know a little bit more about the fair trade movement, that leaves open the question, can fair trade work as intended? So far, we haven't talked at all about whether or not our good intentions are making a difference in the lives of the global poor, wherever they happen to be, and whether they're growing fair trade coffee or fair trade sugar or fair trade bananas or fair trade tea. We haven't talked about this person. Are we making a difference when we buy good person coffee? Well, when you think about what motivates somebody like me to purchase fair trade coffee or not purchase fair trade coffee, there has to be a buy-in from me as a consumer. And one thing that I might be getting, in addition to some delicious coffee, is I might be getting some coffee that tastes a little more delicious to me because I know that I'm doing a good thing. So maybe when I buy coffee, I'm getting something bundled along with it as a consumer. Maybe I'm getting the sweet taste of charity, or maybe I'm getting the sweet taste of social justice. But because I don't visit coffee growers, and because I don't interview them and find out more about their lives and whether their lives are better off as members of the Fair Trade Network, it's difficult for me to assess whether or not my extra money that I'm paying for fair trade coffee is literally paying off in the form of charity or social justice. Another possibility is that when I buy fair trade coffee, I'm making an investment not in coffee growers, but I'm making an investment in myself. And this is what economists refer to as social capital. If I walk into my university classroom with a cup of coffee and that cup of coffee has that equal exchange logo on the front, that sends a certain message to my students. And my students might think, oh, Dr. Claar, he's a good guy, he cares, he doesn't mind spending extra money as long as it's for a good cause and caring for the global poor. And if that's true, then it's like an investment in my image. And so what might I get in exchange? If my students know that I'm drinking certified coffee, I might have a more manageable classroom, I might have better end of the term course evaluations. There might be all manner of ways that making this investment today by buying more expensive coffee that might pay off for me. So this is an actual t-shirt that I own. It's black, so it looks cool. The fit is good, so it looks cool. And there's heavy silk screening, and in relief, the lettering says, proceeds from this shirt benefit my image. So you might from a distance think, oh, that's a guy who cares about Africa. But instead, the message that it's sending is, oh, here is a guy who really cares about himself. And it pays off for him when he looks like he cares about other people. As I mentioned earlier, there's a huge marketing literature about fair trade coffee. And economists have considered fair trade as a form of price discrimination. Now, you've probably heard of price discrimination. It's when you charge two different people different prices for exactly the same good, the same service, or the same experience, because you have a way of sorting out whether they're high value buyers or low value buyers. So typically in a given week when we're not staying at home because of coronavirus, I see price discrimination when I go to the movies, right? When I go to the cinema, if I go at 10:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, I get a very low price. But if I go at 7:30 or 9:30 on the weekend, I pay a premium price. How can movies differentiate and charge different people? Why doesn't everybody go to the movies on Tuesday morning? Because the opportunity cost is really high and many people have better things to do at 10:30 or 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. But if you voluntarily turn up on Friday and Saturday night to pay the premium price, you've sent a signal that you're somebody that can be charged the premium price. So in his book, The Undercover Economist, Financial Times writer Timothy Harford talks about Costa Coffee. Tim Harford really likes cappuccino, and he noticed that at his favorite coffee bar, Costa Coffee, they were charging in American dollars about 25 cents more for a fair trade certified cappuccino than an equivalent cappuccino that didn't have the fair trade label. And so because Tim Harford understands economics, and he's also a good journalist. He contacted Costa Coffee's corporate headquarters. And he said, I've seen that diagram of the coffee prices, those Class C Arabica beans. And I know that coffee growers are only getting about $1.50 for an entire pound of coffee. And it doesn't take that much coffee to produce one fair trade cappuccino. Can you please explain to me where all the money is going when I pay an extra 25 cents for a single cup? Costa Coffee couldn't justify the price difference in terms of their costs and ended up charging the same price for both fair trade certified cappuccinos and ones that were not fair trade certified. So why was Costa charging different prices to different consumers for these two different coffees? Again, they're the same coffee, but one has the fair trade seal and one does not. And the answer, as Harford puts it, is that when you purchased fair trade coffee from Costa Coffee, you sent them two messages. One of those messages was a little boring to them, and that message was, I think fair trade coffee is important and it's a cause that should be supported. The other message that you were sending that they were much more interested in was, I don't mind paying more for coffee as long as you give me a compelling reason to do so. So I'll conclude the talk by telling you a few things that you may not have heard about the fair trade model as it exists today throughout most of the globe. The first thing that you may not know is that, remember, the growers in the network are poor cooperatives that are democratically governed in poor nations. But it's really expensive for a cooperative of poor coffee growers to fill out and submit the application to join the fair trade network. In fact, it costs about 525 euros for a cooperative of small coffee growers just to apply to possibly join the fair trade network. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to start a charitable initiative, my first instinct would not be to charge poor coffee growers 525 euros. That seems counterintuitive to me. And that's not all that the growers pay for. Once you've been admitted to the Fair Trade Network, then I mentioned that there's an independent certifying agency that comes and visits your local growing community. The annual inspection the first year costs those poor coffee growers, depending on the scale of their crop, between 1,500 euros and 3,500 euros. And again, that's just for the first inspection. Every year after that, once they pass the first annual inspection, it costs between 1,200 euros and about 3,000 euros for each annual inspection after that. So it's extremely expensive for these poor coffee growers just to join the network. And even once you've joined the network, there is no guarantee that there is a fair trade importer on the other side of the market who will purchase your coffee at the guaranteed price. In fact, in one notorious case, one cooperative of Mexican coffee growers spent 8 years searching for a willing buyer who was willing to purchase their coffee under the terms of the fair trade agreement, including paying the social premium of 20 cents per pound. Another thing you may not know is that coffee that's not certified as fair trade may have been grown by a fair trade coffee grower. Even champions of fair trade will openly admit that in a typical year, only about 35% of the coffee that's grown by fair trade cooperatives is purchased by fair trade importers like Equal Exchange. Most of the coffee that's grown by fair trade coffee growers goes into the conventional coffee market. So if you started your day with a cup of coffee or two like I did this morning, even if it wasn't certified as fair trade coffee, it may have been grown by a fair trade grower. There simply wasn't enough demand by importers to purchase all of the crop that particular year at the guaranteed price. There are also some strange distributional consequences to fair trade coffee. To take one recent year, the nation of Peru, where there's about a $5,500 per capita income in Peru, they supplied about 25% of all certified fair trade coffees. In the same year, the African nation of Tanzania, where people are much poorer and the per capita GDP is about $500 per year, 1/10 of what it is in Peru. Tanzania makes excellent coffees. If you've had Tanzanian peaberry, you know this. The Tanzanian share of the fair trade coffee market was only 4%. Now, again, I ask you, if your main goal through fair trade is to help out the poorest coffee growers, then why are you importing so much coffee from Peru and so little coffee from a much poorer nation, Tanzania? And the answer lies in the fact that almost all fair trade importers operate as for-profit entities. Even Equal Exchange is organized as a cooperative, not as a not-for-profit. So they're willing to engage in more costly activity on the supply side, as long as the costs aren't too high. So if you purchase coffee from a nation like Brazil, you'll normally get it from coffee growers who have been growing coffee for decades, if not longer. If you're an American coffee importer, you're purchasing from a nation that's located physically, geographically much closer to you, and the coffees are probably already very high quality. Most fair trade coffee comes from then relatively, by global standards, relatively rich nations, and we're enriching already more rich nations like Peru faster than we're enriching the poorest coffee growing nations of all. And then finally, coffee as a fair trade model has been around long enough that we can look at some before and after effects. And there's a wonderful landmark study that was published almost 10 years ago now called the Hohenheim study by German researchers. And they looked at two groups of coffee growers in the same region in Nicaragua. One group joined the Fair Trade Network, paid the application fee, paid the annual inspection fees, and the other group continued to sell coffee to conventional coffee markets. 10 years later, the growers selling coffee to the Fair Trade Network were actually worse off in terms of living standards than those who had continued to participate in the conventional market. And the main reason is that the fees and the annual application costs are so expensive that the coffee growers who had joined the Fair Trade Network couldn't completely recoup the additional costs of joining the network. So to close, let me ask this question. What should you and I do if we care about the poor? And we do. If we want to think of ourselves as nice people, and we do, then what's a caring person to do? And my suggestion to you is do what you do in every other market activity in your life, which is buy the coffee you like that fits your budget best. And why should you do this and not do something else? Well, even if you'd like to be a generous person, there are more efficient, more effective ways for you to care for the global poor than buying overpriced coffee and hoping that a few pennies of that extra money that you're paying for certified fair trade coffee make it all the way to through the supply chain to the coffee growers that you're trying to help. Instead, save some money. Maybe it's just a little money every time you enjoy a cup of coffee, whether it's certified as fair trade or not, and use that money to invest in an NGO that you know is more directly making a difference in the lives of the global poor. As an economist, I know that around the globe, people are able to produce more and earn more when they have better capacity to produce. And sometimes all this involves is simple tools to open a business. Something we take for granted in Western developed nation is the ability of basic language skills and basic math skills to make a difference in an increasingly global economy. And then finally, basic nutrition. Sometimes we take it for granted, things like clean drinking water and 1,500 calories in a day. But for many of the global poor, this is their most pressing concern in any day. So if we could do things to enrich the lives and the productive capacity of individuals, rather than a one-size-fits-all network, we might see more longer-term progress. And I'll close on this note. When you're generous with your money, there's an opportunity cost. That money could have been used to buy something else for yourself. It could have been used as a donation in other charitable enterprises. And so before you spend $1 on fair trade initiatives, consider carefully the opportunity cost and what other things you might have done with that dollar because there are other people on the other side of the market who are also working very hard to earn a living and provide for themselves and their families. And we have an opportunity to reward entrepreneurs who are doing the things we like. And we have an opportunity to discourage production of things that won't lead to an ongoing increase in standards of living. I'll close on that note, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Claar. I'll just screen the questions right now on the screen.
Okay.
Great. The questions should be visible now.
Yeah, I got them.
Yeah. I'll keep scrolling down when you take a question.
All right, so the first question says, in the present scenario, when every country is in defensive mode of their economy, do you think there's any scope for free trade now? I think that's an excellent question. Because of the way that I've talked about fair trade coffee, it probably won't surprise you that the typical fair trade coffee buyer, especially in Western nations like the United States, is somebody who's normally college educated, cares passionately about the poor and other international causes. And so they're able to purchase fair trade coffee even at a premium price because they have the financial resources that make it possible to do so. Our current coronavirus situation is going to decrease the incomes of individuals who often are the ones who are interested in purchasing fair trade coffee, so they might be more careful with their money. Another possibility is individuals who were attracted into the fair trade network because of the guaranteed minimum price and because of the social premium per pound. They may in fact be destroyed in this crisis because if they weren't growing coffee, they might have been doing other productive economic things that maybe didn't rely on international trade networks in order to be a viable business. So one of the ways to think about fair trade coffee is it actually distorts incentives. Normally people leap into action when prices send a signal that people really need more of what you're doing. In the case of fair trade coffee, the fair trade guaranteed minimum price sends an artificial signal about what people need more of. And so it's possible that we've attracted people into an activity that with global supply chain disruptions might not be as viable as other activities might have been otherwise. But of course, we can't know what those would have been because we can't see what people would have done instead. This is an excellent question. Can we expect fair trade integrating in emerging economies? I think that's already happening. I believe that Fair Trade India is a relatively new player in the international fair trade labeling organizations. So it's possible now that Fair Trade India could actually bring fair trade coffees that have been grown in India to coffee drinkers who are also located in India. So I think it's possible, certainly as nations become more affluent and have the ability to pay extra for coffee, it's possible. But again, I don't really think that fair trade delivers on the things that it promises, especially in terms of longer term economic growth and development. So let's see, another question here. Do you believe the fair trade model can be replicated in other industries like fashion? And what's the rest there? It's cut off in my display.
Just a second, I'll just scroll down now.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
So what does it say after fashion? That's what I can't
electronics.
see right now.
Fashion
and electronics.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've already seen this, and I mentioned earlier that you can buy footballs, soccer balls that are certified fair trade soccer balls. One of the things that differentiates fair trade from other charitable initiatives is that it's almost always commodities, right? So it's things that are very similar from one nation to another nation. So it's very difficult for fair trade coffee and fair trade tea and fair trade chocolate and even fair trade footballs to really deliver additional value because there's so much sameness. So when you purchase those fair trade goods, you're doing it motivated partially because you're getting a good or service that you'll enjoy in exchange. And you're also doing it because of your charitable motive. And it will be difficult for people growing something that's very similar to what's being grown or produced in other nations if there's not really much differentiation between one product and another product. In fact, most people, I think, when they're buying fair trade coffees. They're less concerned about the nation of origin, right, where those coffees are sourced from, and they're more concerned about what the coffee is like.
Apologies, doctor. Just a second. Yeah. Can you see the next one?
Oh, okay. So some people here are confusing fair trade with free trade. So fair trade is often used as a brand, right? So I've showed you the fair trade label and fair trade coffee, it's certified. But as an economist, what I would contend is fair is a level playing field for everyone. Big, small, rich, poor. Equal opportunity for everyone is truly free trade, which also is truly fair trade. If you look at who's getting the richest from fair trade initiatives, the certification schemes that I've mentioned earlier, the people who are getting the richest are the roasters in the Western country, the wholesalers in the Western country, the retailers in the Western country. In fact, in one recent study conducted in Finland, if you look at the premium price that you pay for certified fair trade coffees in Finland, most of the money stays in Finland, at the local coffee shop, at the wholesaler, at the roaster, at the importer. And almost none of that additional money that you pay actually makes it all the way up the supply chain. So in that sense, it's very unfair. And that's why in the Nicaraguan study, the Hohenheim study that I mentioned earlier, the coffee growers who were in the conventional market actually made longer term strides over 10 years than the growers in the certified coffee network. So fair trade certified is a label, and it's identified with the conditions that I've articulated already. Truly fair trade coffee is trade that is truly authentically free.
Just a second, doctor. If you could just give us a moment and scroll it down. Personally request you to keep your mics on mute and not use the annotation option. Thank you so much. Please don't accidentally click on the screen.
So there's a question here, isn't the whole movement akin to virtue signaling? And I think that the answer to that is yes. I think that's true for most of us. We might even be sending a signal to ourselves, right? You get economists refer to this as a warm glow effect. That if I do something that I know is harder, or if I pay more than I have to, even if it doesn't make a difference at all, right? If there's no way for me to know or observe whether I've made a difference, because I sacrificed a little bit, because I dug deep and paid more than I had to, rather than being cheap and not caring, I might even get a warm glow inside of myself by feeling that I've done the right thing. So I might be virtue signaling to myself that I'm a good person, but you're also right that because I'm doing something costly, if other people observe that, then I'm making an investment in social capital that might pay off for me because I've signaled to other people that I don't mind paying extra for coffee and I'm a good person. Yeah, Krishna asks an excellent question. Is there any advantage to fair trade coffee in dire times, especially when the price plummets? Fair trade may be helpful. It's really helpful to try to understand why, based on what I've told you in the lecture, why poor coffee growers working in cooperatives in poor nations go ahead and pay these fabulous high prices in order to join the network. Why would you pay 525 euros to join and then another 1,200 to 3,500 euros every year after that for the monitoring and compliance? Because coffee prices do move around so much, right? They are so volatile. Then when you join the Fair Trade Network, it acts a little bit like insurance for you, because if coffee prices do plummet, then you are guaranteed a minimum price. But remember, not all of your coffee in that year will be sold at the guaranteed minimum price. Again, in a typical year, only about a third of certified fair trade coffee actually gets marketed as certified fair trade coffee. The rest ends up in the conventional market. A book I'd highly recommend it's actually a novel, and it's called The Taste of Many Mountains. I'll repeat that. The title is The Taste of Many Mountains, and it's written by an economist who teaches at the University of San Francisco and works in economic development. His name is Bruce Wydick, W-Y-D-I-C-K. Wydick. Again, it's Bruce Wydick, Wydick. And Professor Wydick tells a fictional account of actual field studies that he conducted with families and cooperatives of coffee growers throughout the developing world, in particular Latin America. And he visited with them and wanted to find out from their individual perspectives, why? Why are you joining if it's so expensive? Why are you joining if the research shows that it won't make a big difference in your life, even over the course of 10 or 15 years? And so it's interesting because even though the names have all been changed, it's really interesting to read that book and find out why fair trade coffee sounds attractive, even though as an economist, I can tell you that it's actually getting people to produce more coffee than they otherwise would, and it's not paying off in terms of improving the lives of the global poor over the longer term. So that book is very, very helpful. Oh, so let me, there's a question here about the impact of advertising. And I think this is a really interesting question. In different countries and for different corporations, the fair trade label works differently. So in the United States, with Fair Trade USA, when I see that seal, it's totally up to me whether or not, as a consumer, to make that individual decision to purchase fair trade coffee. But you've also seen some higher level decisions where organizations and companies, as part of their corporate social responsibility marketing, are in fact purchasing fair trade coffee. So there are many university campuses here in the United States that are seeking a certification from fair trade as a fair trade campus, so that a given minimum amount of the coffee that they serve on campus, the sugar, the tea, the chocolate that's available on campus, their school can get a fair trade certification so that they look like a caring institution. If you buy fair trade coffee at McDonald's in Poland, now I'll talk about the Polish example because I've seen this firsthand, it's not up to me. All of the coffee that's sold by McDonald's in Poland is certified fair trade. And if you go through the drive-through at McDonald's in the morning and you get your cup of coffee in Poland, the seal is already on the cup. So McDonald's in Poland is sending a message to you that they're a caring company, and they're not just buying cheap coffee for you, they're buying ethical coffee, they're paying extra for it, and they're trying to make a difference in the lives of the poor. So the impact of advertising in the fair trade model really varies from country to country and from culture to culture, and also from organization to organization. Yeah, so there's another comment here. It says, to me, fair trade looks like a capitalistic option in which poor countries don't have much of a say. And I think that's a good point. The democratic governance that the fair trade label promises, it's about governance of that cooperative in that particular location. But the fair trade model is presented as a take it or leave it model to those coffee growers. So they have to decide whether or not to join the network under the terms of the fair trade network and the certifying organization. Now, I don't know what Equal Exchange in Boston, Massachusetts is thinking about right now when they purchase fair trade coffee, they market fair trade coffee, and they sell it, and American consumers buy it. I don't know what they're thinking today. My suspicion is that at the end of the 1980s, when they moved coffee around the globe to buy coffee from Nicaraguan coffee growers in solidarity with them, their hearts probably were in the right place. But if I'm a coffee shop in Southwest Florida, and I know that people are willing to pay extra for certified fair trade coffees, they may not have the same noble intentions that there were at the beginning, the very beginning of the fair trade movement. And that raises another important point. I mentioned earlier that most of us, we buy the more expensive coffee, but we never have any idea whether it's making a difference. That wasn't true at the beginning of the fair trade movement. In the early 90s, if you were an Equal Exchange customer, you regularly had the opportunity to fly down with other coffee drinkers who buy Equal Exchange and go visit with the coffee growers who are supplying you with delicious coffee under these guaranteed conditions. Today, we rely largely on marketing to persuade us that these conditions are in fact being obeyed and respected.
Dr. Claar, before we proceed, I just wanted to confirm if you'd be okay with us extending it for another 10 minutes since we have already run out of time. We had a lot
Oh,
of
sure.
more interesting questions. If it's all
Yeah,
right,
excellent.
we take some more questions.
Yeah, let me take a look here.
Yeah. I'll just scroll up once, so just in case, see if there were better questions which voted up. No, these all questions have been answered.
Oh, that's right, because with Slido, it's dynamic.
Yes, some questions might have been.
Okay. Yeah, so this question about price signaling, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that fair trade does is it encourages a little more production of coffee. And so it distorts this decision-making environment for poor coffee growers. It makes growing coffee look a little more attractive than it might otherwise, again, largely because of the risk reduction. When you join the fair trade network, the risk of a price drop is taken away from you. But if you create an incentive for people to do something they wouldn't do otherwise, then it distorts their decision-making environment, and they don't do the thing that they would have turned to instead that might have a longer, more sustainable life. And instead, they end up continuing to grow fair trade coffee. So in the monograph, I refer to fair trade once you're in the network as sort of being like golden handcuffs. Once you've made the investment, you've invested your family's wealth, such as it is, you've invested their time, you've converted arable land to growing coffee, then it's really, really difficult to move out of that given the investment that you've made. It keeps people doing something that may not be as productive and as valuable as other things they could be doing instead.
I just scroll through again to see if there's some other question you'd like to pick.
Sure.
These are here now.
Oh, let me field the latest question because
Yeah.
it's an excellent one. It asks about, can large plantations opt in or out for fair trade certification? So because we have an international audience today, I focused on Fair Trade International. Everything that I've said is even worse if you look at Fair Trade USA. About 9 years ago, Fair Trade USA broke away from Fair Trade International, and Fair Trade USA now has its own licensing and certification of the label. One of the reasons that Fair Trade broke away is because buying coffee from cooperatives of small coffee growers is really expensive. So Fair Trade USA wanted to be able to get even cheaper sourced coffee in order to slap a fair trade label on it. So they started their own fair trade certification. It's called Fair Trade USA. It has a different seal. It doesn't have that blue and green oval with the arms stretching up. It doesn't have that. And when you buy Fair Trade USA, it probably came from a large scale plantation, even though I think the Fair Trade Network wants to preserve this idea of this romantic notion of small scale coffee growers forming cooperatives and governing themselves democratically. Fair Trade USA realized that there was more money to be made if they could lower their input costs and certification costs. And the most convenient way to do that was to buy from large scale plantations. So the promises you get with Fair Trade USA are even weaker than the promises that you get with Fair Trade International.
Doctor, the first question, I don't think we had seen it at that moment. Just a second. The one about WTO. I'll just bring it up again.
Let me take a look.
Yeah, because of its dynamic nature, it's just
Right.
Yeah, these
they
two
move
questions.
around. Oh, there it was.
Yeah, these two, the WTO
Okay.
and the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, the question about the WTO, I actually don't have a good answer for that. That's a consideration I haven't looked at very carefully. So, but I think that's a really good question and one that's worth looking into, but I don't know the answer there. And then the other question, the one below it, about market distortions or regulations. I think that every one of these charitable initiatives, I've talked mostly about fair trade coffee, but there are other initiatives also. There's a chain of retail shops that operate as a not-for-profit in the United States called 10,000 Villages. And there, the goods that you purchase are different. I mentioned that fair trade is focused on commodities. Fair Trade International is focused on tea and coffee and sugar. In the case of something like 10,000 Villages, they sell unique garments, they sell unique handcrafts, they sell unique tools that are beautiful. And they're also things that I can't walk into my local Walmart or my local department store and find. So in the case of 10,000 Villages, it's harder for me to be critical of 10,000 Villages because they're in fact acting as a middle person, just like any other middle person in a market, to connect producers who are making valuable things to consumers who would appreciate them for their value, not because they're giving to a charitable cause. So even though I've sounded fairly pessimistic about fair trade, I do think that every single one of these caring consumer initiatives needs to be evaluated independently from the others.
There's a question on China and fair trade that I found interesting.
I saw that. You know, it's funny, as a guy who's been to China for the last 3 summers and drinks a lot of coffee, including at Costa and Pacific Coffee, I don't know the answer to that, either on the consumption side or on the production side. I know that most of China isn't really suited to growing coffee because of the latitude, but I guess it's possible in southwestern China, in the foothills of the Himalayas, it might be possible to grow some coffee there. But in terms of if you walk into Costa Coffee in Beijing, whether or not you have a fair trade option, I'm not sure.
Thank you, doctor. Just a second. There's this question on COVID and pharma companies engaging in fair trade.
I think it's really hard to make that forecast because the COVID situation is changing so rapidly. I think it's hard to make an assessment over whether or not pharmaceutical companies might try to leverage that in some way. I just don't know. Everything is happening too quickly. Yeah, so I'll field the question under that. I think that's a great question. If you are rewarding people who are growing okay coffee, wouldn't you be better off taking the money you're investing to give it to the people who are growing legitimately wonderful coffee? And so there's a story that in field studies, one of my co-authors has uncovered. And the story goes like this. Yeah, we sell our coffee to both the fair trade importer that we have a partnership with, and we also sell our coffee in the conventional market because that's what everybody does. Some goes to fair trade and some does not. If in a particular year you had some coffee that wasn't very delicious, you might be very tempted as the grower to take that coffee that wasn't very good, that wouldn't be able to command much of a price on its own, and put it in, or at least mix it in, to the coffee that you're selling to your fair trade importer. So there's a perverse incentive for the coffee growers to take substandard coffees that they know wouldn't command much of a price if they were sold without the fair trade label, to mix some of those inferior beans into the beans that they're selling to the fair trade importer, because they get a guaranteed minimum higher price, plus they get that social premium on every single pound that they sell. So I do think there's a distortion, not only in terms of encouraging people to produce coffee they wouldn't produce otherwise, but also encouraging people to maybe not try to make the very best coffee they can given their current conditions. Instead, they might settle for growing an inferior coffee, knowing that they can unload some of it at the guaranteed minimum price.
Giorgio, I think we could take one more question.
Okay.
Yes,
Oh yeah. So let's answer that one. If fair trade is actually intended to help the growers, why is the application process so expensive, and why aren't there guaranteed buyers on the other side of the market? I think the reason is that, again, because the lives of the global poor growing coffee are so fragile, then this is a very tempting offer. And again, this is where field studies are really helpful. And the Bruce Weidick book that I mentioned earlier is very helpful, because even though he's changed the names, these are still the actual interviews that he and his grad students at University of San Francisco conducted with growers in the Fair Trade Network. And you can gain a better understanding of how negatively they perceive the risk involved with not knowing what they'll be able to sell their crop for at the end of the growing season, and how tempted they might be to enter the Fair Trade Coffee Network as a form of purchasing insurance, even though over the longer term, that is a strategy that doesn't pay off and they don't recoup the premium.
Thank you so much, Doctor. We have way too many questions and we have run out of time today, and we don't think we can keep taking these questions, because I'm sure Doctor would agree that this conversation can go on for a very, very long time.
Great.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for hosting this.
Thank you, everyone. We have shared a feedback form in the chat. Please fill in the form. The recording of this session would be available on YouTube if you want to ever go back and listen to it again. Thank you so much, everybody. It was great having you. It was a genuine pleasure listening to you, Dr. Claar.
Thanks so much for putting this together.